October 6, 1973. On Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar, a surprise attack suddenly throws Israel into a desperate fight for its own survival. A massive two-front invasion by Egypt and Syria catches the nation completely off guard, and the Israeli military, once seen as invincible, is now taking staggering losses. As its army reeled and equipment losses piled up at a terrifying rate, Israel sent a secret plea to the one nation that could save it, the United States. But the decision to help would push the world to the brink of nuclear war and trigger a global crisis that brought entire economies to their knees. This is the story of the airlift that stared down the Soviet Union and almost started World War III. In the fall of 1973, Israel was feeling confident, maybe a little too confident. After its stunning victory in the 1967 Six-Day War, its military was considered the undisputed power in the Middle East. The Bar-Lev Line, a chain of fortifications along the Suez Canal, was thought to be an unbreakable barrier against any Egyptian attack. But this confidence was built on a catastrophic intelligence failure. Both Israeli and U.S. intelligence agencies believed war was unlikely, misinterpreting Arab military buildups as mere exercises. While Israel rested on its laurels, Egypt and Syria were meticulously planning their revenge. They were armed with a huge arsenal of advanced Soviet weapons, including hundreds of sophisticated surface-to-air missiles, MiG-21 fighter jets, and thousands of tanks. Their strategy was brutally simple: a coordinated, overwhelming surprise attack. On October 6th, they unleashed that plan. On the southern front, thousands of Egyptian soldiers swept across the Suez Canal, using high-powered water cannons to blast through the sand walls of the Bar-Lev Line, while a massive artillery barrage of over 2,000 guns and mortars provided cover. At the exact same time, Syrian tanks surged into the Golan Heights in the north, quickly overwhelming the thinly spread Israeli defenders. The Israeli Air Force, long the master of the skies, was suddenly neutralized. A dense network of new Soviet SA-6 anti-aircraft missiles, something the Israelis had never faced, was taking a devastating toll. In the first few days of the war, the losses were shocking. A transcript from a secret meeting with U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger on October 9th revealed that Israel had lost 49 planes and roughly 500 tanks, with most of the tank losses on the Egyptian front. The country was burning through its military stockpiles at a rate it simply couldn't sustain. For the first time, Israel faced the real possibility of a major military defeat. In a state of desperation, Prime Minister Golda Meir sent an urgent, secret message to Washington. The message was crystal clear: without an immediate and massive resupply of weapons and ammunition, Israel was in danger. Some reports, though still debated by historians, suggest that Meir ordered Israel's nuclear missiles to be readied as a last resort, a move intended to be seen by American intelligence to underscore just how serious the situation had become. The world's two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, were now locked in a high-stakes proxy war. With Israeli forces reeling, what would the United States do? Golda Meir's plea landed on President Richard Nixon's desk right in the middle of a political firestorm. The Watergate scandal was exploding, and his administration was paralyzed. Vice President Spiro Agnew had just resigned over a corruption scandal, and Nixon himself was increasingly consumed by the crisis that would eventually force him out of office. Declassified phone calls from the time show that National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger was often left to manage the crisis. But despite the chaos at home, the geopolitical stakes were just too high to ignore. The Soviet Union had already started its own massive airlift to resupply Egypt and Syria on October 10th. If Washington just stood by and let its key Middle Eastern ally get crushed by Soviet-backed states, American credibility on the world stage would be shattered. The decision to act, however, was incredibly risky. A direct resupply of Israel could provoke a direct showdown with the Soviet Union. On top of that, the Arab nations, organized under OPEC, had explicitly threatened to use the oil weapon, a complete embargo, against any country that helped Israel. For several critical days, the White House was stuck. Secretary of Defense James Schlesinger was reportedly hesitant, creating bureaucratic delays that drove Kissinger crazy. Their first attempt was a covert one, using Israel's own El Al commercial airliners to fly in some supplies. But it was just a drop in the ocean. The sheer amount of material Israel needed, tanks, artillery, and replacement jets, was way beyond what a few commercial planes could carry. On October 12th, as Israel's situation grew more desperate by the hour, Nixon made his move. Overruling the dissenters, he famously told Kissinger, "Send everything that can fly." It's a quote from his memoirs, not an official transcript, but it captures the moment perfectly. Within 9 hours, the United States Air Force kicked off Operation Nickelgrass. This was a logistical challenge of almost unimaginable scale. The backbone of the airlift was the Military Airlift Command's fleet of C-141 Starlifters and, most importantly, the brand-new C-5 Galaxy. At the time, the C-5 was widely seen as an expensive, deeply flawed failure. This operation would be its ultimate test. The problems were huge. First, the distance. A staggering 6,450 nautical miles from the U.S. to Israel. Even worse, America's European allies wanted nothing to do with it. Fearing the Arab oil embargo, countries like Spain, Italy, and Germany refused U.S. planes permission to land, refuel, or even fly through their airspace. For a moment, it looked like the airlift was logistically impossible. The entire operation was saved by one crucial ally, Portugal. It agreed to let the U.S. use Lodge's Field in the Azores as a refueling stop. With that one stop secured, the air bridge was officially open. For 32 straight days, American military transports streamed across the Atlantic, refueled in the Azores, and then flew a knife-edge route over the Mediterranean, carefully avoiding both European and Arab airspace, before landing at Lod Airport in Tel Aviv. U.S. Navy ships from the Sixth Fleet were stationed along the route to provide protection and support for the vulnerable transports. The first C-5 Galaxy landed in Israel on October 14th, and its arrival had an immediate, dramatic impact. The C-5s ended up carrying nearly half the total cargo in just a fraction of the missions, hauling outsized equipment that no other plane could, like M60 tanks, heavy artillery, and even entire A-4 Skyhawk fighter jets. Operation Nickelgrass completely vindicated the C-5 program. By the time the airlift ended on November 14th, the United States had flown 567 missions and delivered over 22,000 tons of military hardware. This massive flood of supplies allowed Israel to stop the Arab advance, stabilize its fronts, and launch a devastating counterattack that turned the tide of the war. But this incredible rescue mission would come at a terrifying global price. While American planes were landing in Tel Aviv, the Arab world was making its move. On October 19, 1973, in direct retaliation for Operation Nickelgrass, the Arab members of OPEC, led by Saudi Arabia, made good on their threat. They announced a full oil embargo against the United States and other nations that supported Israel, like the Netherlands and Portugal. The effect was immediate and seismic. The price of a barrel of oil didn't just rise. It quadrupled, jumping from around $3 to $12. For an American economy that had become hooked on foreign oil, the shock was brutal. The result was the 1973 oil crisis. Suddenly, Americans faced massive gas shortages. Stations either ran out of fuel or started rationing, leading to lines of cars that snaked for blocks. The crisis helped trigger a severe global recession and introduced the world to an unpleasant new word, stagflation, that toxic mix of a stagnant economy and high inflation. The oil embargo sent shockwaves through the West, but an even more dangerous crisis was brewing in the shadows. As American supplies enabled Israel to push deep into Syria and encircle Egypt's Third Army, the Soviet Union saw its allies heading for a humiliating defeat. Soviet Premier Leonid Brezhnev was furious. On October 24th, he sent a startling message to Nixon, threatening to unilaterally send Soviet troops to the Middle East to enforce a ceasefire. American intelligence picked up even more alarming signs. Several Soviet airborne divisions, totaling tens of thousands of troops, were placed on high alert. A Soviet ship believed to be carrying nuclear weapons was reportedly heading for Egypt. The Kremlin was making it clear. It was ready to intervene directly. The White House convened an emergency meeting of senior officials. With President Nixon distracted by Watergate, they made one of the most chilling decisions of the Cold War. At 11:41 p.m. on October 24, 1973, they gave the order to raise the United States Defense Readiness Condition to DEFCON 3. This wasn't a drill. DEFCON 3 is the highest level of peacetime readiness, just 2 steps from all-out nuclear war. For the first time since the Cuban Missile Crisis, U.S. strategic bombers were put on alert and military forces around the world were readied for a potential war. The message to Moscow was unmistakable. If you intervene, you risk war with the United States. For a few terrifying hours, the world held its breath. The 2 nuclear-armed superpowers stood eyeball to eyeball. But the American signal worked. The The Soviets, while annoyed, were not willing to call the bluff and back down. Brezhnev assured Washington that no unilateral action was planned. The Soviet ships dispersed, and the crisis slowly de-escalated. A ceasefire finally took hold on October 25th, ending the war. World War III had been averted, but the confrontation showed just how close the airlift had pushed the planet to the edge. The 1973 airlift is a powerful reminder of how logistics can change history and how a regional war can quickly spiral into a global crisis. If you're interested in another story where a bold decision shook the Cold War, check out our video on the Able Archer 83 exercise, another moment the world unknowingly came minutes from Armageddon. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell for more stories about these pivotal moments. Operation Nickel Grass was a truly world-changing event. The airlift saved Israel from a potential military disaster, allowing it to turn the tables and ultimately negotiate from a position of strength. The diplomatic groundwork laid by Kissinger after the war paved the way for future agreements, including the landmark 1979 peace treaty between Egypt and Israel. But the consequences were profound and permanent. The 1973 oil crisis brought the era of cheap, abundant energy to a screeching halt, forcing Western nations to completely rethink their energy policies and create strategic petroleum reserves. It kicked off a new age of energy consciousness and showed the immense geopolitical power wielded by oil-producing nations. Most critically, the airlift and the nuclear alert that followed redrew the lines of the Cold War. It was a stark demonstration of America's logistical power and its unwavering commitment to its allies. The operation cemented the U.S.-Israel strategic alliance for decades to come, while at the same time exposing deep cracks in the NATO alliance. A single, desperate airlift didn't just decide the fate of a nation. It also triggered a global economic crisis and brought two superpowers to the precipice of a war that could have ended the world.